I found myself gradually becoming interested in his life, the life he led after we parted. This realization made me uneasy, as if I had been left behind and now felt an inexplicable ache from being discarded. Our initial connection wasn't intended to be long-lasting. We each carried our own private sadness, simply looking for someone to share fleeting comfort. We'd meet up for dinners, sing together, or even share intimacy, but never stepped over the line into romance. Love, to us, was more forbidden than physical connection. Over a year passed, and our bond remained one of genuine friendship. Neither of us was married. Both of us were unattached, yet couldn't commit to being more than friends. Occasionally, people mistook us for a couple, but we'd quickly set the record straight. We both continued seeing others, attending parties, and drinking without prying into each other's personal lives. I noticed he valued his career above all, avoiding the effort of deciphering a woman's complexities. I, on the other hand, knew I was indifferent, seeking only the warmth of occasional companionship. In truth, we were well suited for one another. Still, what kept us tethered was our perfect harmony in that one unspoken area. We openly acknowledged missing each other, specifically when in bed. We fit together seamlessly, like complementary puzzle pieces, feeling fulfilled when entangled. "I'm getting married," he said one day, as I was slipping on my shirt. I smiled, a hint of disbelief in my eyes. "I thought you'd stay single forever. She's from a good family. My parents approve. She's gentle, pretty, and will make a good wife." He jokingly asked me, "What about you? Do you plan to get married?" I simply replied that I wasn't thinking about it now. The first few days apart were somewhat difficult, as we had been together for nearly 2 years. I remembered our first meeting at a grocery store, where he helped me reach something from a high shelf, and we exchanged phone numbers. Even now, we still respected each other. Whenever we met, we would rush into each other like moths to a flame, then go our separate ways. We never spent a night together or stayed with each other for more than 3 hours, because both of us were busy people. Many times, my mother asked if I still had a boyfriend, but I denied it. He wasn't a boyfriend. He was just a lover. I heard that his wedding would be held romantically on a beautiful beach. He had a career, and the bride's family was also well off, so the elaborate wedding arrangements didn't surprise me. His fiancée was 25 years old and a writer. When I found out, I bought one of her books to read, but I couldn't get into it. The author kept going on and on about everlasting love. Then I heard that after the wedding, he would take her to Singapore for a week-long honeymoon. While staying in that place, I wondered if making love with his wife would be like making love with me. Would he call her name sweetly like that? I realized I was gradually becoming interested in his life, the life he had after he left me. It made me uncomfortable. It felt as if I had just been discarded, and now I was showing distress over being cast aside by him. People say that whatever is repeated too many times becomes a habit. Nearly 2 years might not seem like much, but it was enough time for me to form a habit. Suddenly, I found myself missing him like crazy. I began to realize that, over time, I was slowly becoming more and more interested in his life, the life he had started to build after he left me. It wasn't something I had planned or even wanted to feel, but the sensation was there, creeping up on me. It made me feel uneasy, as though I had been discarded so carelessly, like an old thing no longer needed. And now I found myself struggling with the fact that I had been left behind. It was as though the hurt of being cast aside by him was slowly consuming me. They say that anything repeated enough times becomes a habit. At first, I didn't think much of it. 2 years isn't really a long time, is it? But as the days stretched on, I began to realize that it was more than just passing time. It had been long enough for me to unconsciously form a pattern, a routine of sorts without even meaning to. And just like that, I found myself missing him, longing for him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The intensity of that feeling surprised me. I hadn't expected it, but there it was, a constant ache deep inside me. Things only stopped there. 2 weeks after our separation, I managed to stabilize somewhat. At work, a guy had expressed his interest in me, and eventually, I agreed to go out with him. Among the 5 people pursuing me at the time, I felt he was the most genuine and sincere. 3 months later, I agreed to marry him. It was as fleeting as a summer rain. This man was incredibly gentle, almost too gentle it bordered on weakness. He never raised his voice, never asserted himself, and rarely made a decision without consulting me first. All of my free time seemed to slip away as I spent it alone, lost in the world of games and distractions. He, on the other hand, was content in his own routine. He handed over his salary to me every month without question and followed my instructions without hesitation. I managed everything, his choices, his finances, even his schedule, and I didn't have to ask. He simply obeyed. But somewhere along the way, I began to realize that this sense of control, this complete surrender of his will, made me feel more like a caretaker than a partner. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself that his gentleness was something I could nurture, that it was something I could help grow into strength. But soon enough, the weight of managing everything began to overwhelm me. I started questioning everything, including why I had agreed to marry him in the first place. I felt as though I was drowning in a sea of monotony, a dullness that seemed to define our everyday. The days blended into each other, and the quiet, predictable life we led made me feel trapped. There were moments when I seriously considered divorce. The thought of breaking free from this suffocating routine tugged at me constantly. But every time I looked at him, something stopped me. His wide, trusting eyes, his quiet manner, his utter dependence on me, all of it stirred a kind of pity in me. I didn't want to hurt him, even though I felt like I was suffocating in this relationship. One evening, as we sat together in the silence of our living room, he asked me a question that seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that surrounded it. "Do you love me?" my husband suddenly asked, his voice soft but earnest. The question caught me off guard. I didn't want to answer, to expose the truth of my feelings, but I knew that he was searching for reassurance. Part of me didn't want to lie, but another part of me, one that was too weary to fight anymore, told me that it didn't matter. We were already married, our lives already intertwined, and perhaps love was irrelevant at this point. I had stayed with him this long after all, and that had to count for something. I took a deep breath, and with as much sincerity as I could muster, I replied, "Yes, I love you." It was a simple answer, but in that moment, it felt hollow. He didn't press me further, didn't ask why or how I felt, as if he didn't really want to know the truth behind my words. The conversation ended there, as quickly as it had started, leaving me with the sinking feeling that I had just given him the answer he needed to hear, not the one I truly felt. He seemed content with my reply, and for that moment, that was enough. But for me, the silence that followed was more deafening than any words could have been. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of drawers being opened and papers rustling. My heart sank, a gnawing anxiety creeping through my chest. When I walked into the kitchen, he was already there, standing stiffly by the table. His face looked pale and set, as if he had made a decision that had cost him everything. On the table, divorce papers sat neatly, each page a silent declaration of the end. He looked at me and said, almost mechanically, "I need you to sign these." I stared at the papers, my mind reeling. This was the man who had followed my every lead, who had given me his salary without a second thought, who had needed me to navigate even the smallest aspects of life. Yet now, here he was, taking a decisive step I never imagined him capable of. The shock froze me in place, and for a moment, I could only hear the pounding of my heart. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening, as if he had been holding his breath for hours. "We married too quickly. We didn't even get the chance to love each other. I've fallen in love with someone else." My mind struggled to process his words. The room seemed to shrink around me, but I forced myself to keep looking at him, to hold on to my composure. "You said you loved me," I shot back, more out of disbelief than anger. His eyes darted away, and he rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that only reinforced how ill-equipped he was to face confrontation. "That was also too hasty," he admitted, his voice trailing off. Silence settled between us like a heavy blanket. The walls seemed to echo our unspoken thoughts. I needed to hear more, to push back against the numbness seeping into my limbs. "Who is she?" He glanced up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected: regret, perhaps, or relief. "I met her through a game," he said, almost sheepishly. "We've met a few times, but she understands me, and we're happy together. I felt a sudden clarity, a release from something I hadn't even realized was holding me captive. I understood. I had felt that way once, long ago, with someone who made me laugh without trying, who made me feel alive. But with him, my current husband, I had spent years trapped in a cycle of predictability and obligation. Our marriage had turned into a routine, a place where I managed everything and felt the weight of both our lives pressing down on me. It felt like a collar, tight and unyielding. For a moment, memories of the early days flooded back our hurried wedding, the brief moments of hope, the shared silence that had quickly become our norm. But when he said he had found someone else, I didn't feel anger or betrayal. I felt relief, as if a window had opened in a room I hadn't realized was airless. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening, as if he had been holding his breath for hours. We married too quickly. We didn't even get the chance to love each other. I've fallen in love with someone else. My mind struggled to process his words. The room seemed to shrink around me, but I forced myself to keep looking at him, to hold on to my composure. You said you loved me. I shot back, more out of disbelief than anger. His eyes darted away, and he rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that only reinforced how ill-equipped he was to face confrontation. That was also too hasty, he admitted, his voice trailing off. Silence settled between us like a heavy blanket. The walls seemed to echo our unspoken thoughts. I needed to hear more, to push back against the numbness seeping into my limbs. Who is she? He glanced up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected: regret, perhaps, or relief. I met her through a game, he said, almost sheepishly. We've met a few times, but she understands me, and we're happy together. I felt a sudden clarity, a release from something I hadn't even realized was holding me captive. I understood. I had felt that way once, long ago, with someone who made me laugh without trying, who made me feel alive. But with him, my current husband, I had spent years trapped in a cycle of predictability and obligation. Our marriage had turned into a routine, a place where I managed everything and felt the weight of both our lives pressing down on me. It felt like a collar, tight and unyielding. For a moment, memories of the early days flooded back our hurried wedding, the brief moments of hope, the shared silence that had quickly become our norm. But when he said he had found someone else, I didn't feel anger or betrayal. I felt relief, as if a window had opened in a room I hadn't realized was airless. I took the pen from the table, my hand steady as I signed the papers. The room was so quiet I could hear the scratch of the ink against the paper. I glanced at him, and he looked as though he wanted to say something, but he remained silent. We only have one house and a joint savings account, I said, breaking the silence. What do you plan to do about that? He hesitated, then met my gaze with an expression I hadn't seen before, an odd mix of resolve and guilt. I'll take the savings. You take the house. I raised an eyebrow, surprised by his choice. Won't that be unfair to you? He smiled faintly, the first real sign of emotion he'd shown all morning. I'll give you back the time you spent with me. There was a finality to his words that stung, not because of pain but because of their truth. I nodded, feeling an unexpected lightness settle over me. As he left, I stood there in the silent kitchen, watching the sunlight spill across the table and wondering what the future held. No longer bound by the life that had once confined me, he had come to the same understanding, something I hadn't expected. It's often said that women are more sensitive, but men can possess a deep awareness too. When someone truly loves you, it can be subtle, even easy to overlook amid daily routines. But when that love fades, the absence is stark and undeniable. The silence between conversations grows heavier. The shared spaces become vast and empty, and the bond that once felt natural starts to feel like a strained obligation. That sense of detachment, of being alone even when you're together, is unmistakable. We both experienced that unsettling realization, the mutual understanding that something essential had been lost, and neither of us could ignore it any longer. His new partner was a younger woman, radiant with youthful energy and a fair, flawless complexion. She stood waiting for him just outside the People's Court, her eyes scanning the crowd until they met mine. For a brief moment, we locked eyes and exchanged polite, strained smiles, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tangled web that had brought us to this moment. Never before in my life had I encountered a situation so intricate, so layered with irony and acceptance. She was the person who had taken his affection, the one now standing by his side. And yet, as I observed her, I felt neither bitterness nor anger. Instead, there was an unexpected calm, a sense of detachment that surprised even me. The past had played out as it was meant to, and somehow, that knowledge brought a strange kind of peace. In today's world, divorce has lost much of its stigma. It has become as commonplace as ending a relationship when love fades. After the final papers were signed, I sent my ex-husband a simple congratulatory message, wishing him well and hoping he would find new happiness. Life moved on, as it always does, and with it came new faces and fleeting connections. This time, however, I approached relationships with caution. I no longer allowed myself to shoulder the weight of commitment or surrender to deep emotional TIs. Love was something I kept at arm's length, intimate enough to feel, but distant enough to escape. These men became temporary companions, filling the void without any expectations of permanence. We would share moments, part ways, and move on to the next chapter without looking back. They were free to come and go, and so was I. Our meetings were full of warmth and laughter, but the invisible boundary remained. We could be close, but never cross that line, never venture into a space where responsibility and vulnerability might bind me again. This was my new way of living, untethered, unburdened, navigating between connection and solitude. And in the impermanence of it all, I found a fragile peace. That evening, I walked into a luxurious hotel with a man who was undeniably attractive, freshly separated from his wife. He wasn't just a stranger, he was my business partner. As we mingled at the event, I couldn't help but notice him stealing glances in my direction from time to time. Later, as I stepped out of the car, I collided with someone. Looking up, I was taken aback to see that it was my ex-lover, the one I had been secretly in touch with for the past year. But to my surprise, he didn't acknowledge me. His expression remained neutral, and after a polite, almost detached apology, he walked away, his arm around his wife. "Wait," I murmured under my breath, but neither of them heard me. They simply continued walking away, oblivious to my presence. It was then that I noticed, to my shock, that the woman walking beside him was none other than the woman who had been my ex-husband's lover. She, too, acted as though she didn't recognize me. The two of them strolled down the street, hand in hand, with a child in tow, looking completely content and oblivious to the weight of the situation. It wasn't until the man turned to me, breaking the silence, that I was jolted from my thoughts. "Is that someone you know?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. I didn't know how to respond. Were they acquaintances? Was I supposed to acknowledge the connection? It was all so complicated, and I couldn't find the right words to explain the tangled web of emotions and history that surrounded the moment. Could the world really be so perfectly round? The thought echoed in my mind, and I let out a soft, almost bitter laugh as I watched them walk away, their figures shrinking in the distance. The streetlights flickered faintly in the gathering dusk, casting long shadows over the pavement as they disappeared from view. A chilly breeze swept through the air, ruffling the hem of my coat, and for a moment, I felt the weight of the quiet pressing down on me. No, it wasn't that the world was round. I couldn't make that claim anymore. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the sound of their footsteps faded. The city felt distant, almost foreign now. As I let my gaze wander over the passing crowd, something clicked inside me, a sharp realization that the people I had encountered weren't so different after all. Each one seemed so engrossed in their own world, their own struggles, their own little bubbles of hope and heartache. Everyone, it seemed, was searching for something, grasping at whatever they could to fill the void within them. The woman and the man, the child they walked with, even the strangers hurrying past, they were all just desperate to find someone, anyone, to ease the loneliness and uncertainty that gnawed at their hearts. My breath caught in my throat as I felt a pang of familiarity in their struggles, a deep, unsettling recognition. But in the end, it seemed impossible to know who or even what we should truly love. The answers were elusive, always just out of reach, slipping through my fingers like sand. The moments felt fleeting, too brief to hold on to, but they piled up, one after another, forming a long trail of unanswered questions. I stood there, watching the world move around me, feeling both part of it and entirely apart from it, as if I were searching for the same thing but never quite finding it.